Hello, my name is Taylor Hopkins. You might recognize the gentleman in the photo with me. He's Ken Ausk, one of the founders of BackCountry Horsemen, and also my grandfather. My grandpa started passing down his knowledge of packing to me when I was 8, and I've been taking pack trips into the Bob ever since with my family, the BackCountry Horsemen, Bob Marshall Wilderness Foundation, and Boy Scouts. I've worked for the Forest Service and the Selway Bitterroot Frank Church Foundation, helping to keep trails open. I'll be graduating from the University of Montana in a couple of months with degrees in resource conservation and climate change studies. I'm sure I can attribute my love of the great outdoors, especially the Bob, in part to my family, and I plan to keep the packing tradition alive. It is my honor to read this history of the BackCountry Horsemen written by my grandfather in 1995. I have been asked many times over the years to write a history about the formation of the first BackCountry Horsemen Club. I'm sure that wasn't because of my writing ability, but merely because I was there. The importance of these events has finally prompted me to attempt this through memory, newsletters, and other writings. Perhaps the reason that BackCountry Horsemen started in the Flathead Valley of western Montana has more to do with geography than with the individuals involved. Our proximity to the Bob Marshall Wilderness has given us many opportunities and some far-reaching problems. The Bob Marshall was one of the nation's first designated wildernesses and the first to have a wilderness management plan. It was the first to have the Limits of Acceptable Change, or LAC, concept of land management applied as a management regulation. Regulations developed here have had widespread application in many areas. Flathead backcountry horsemen have been both blessed and damned because the advantage of early input has mandated very careful, responsible comment. The names of the people involved are important only for historical purposes. What is important is the spirit and determination of that charter group. That spirit and determination are what form the foundation philosophy of BCH, and that is the strength of all of our BCH groups, regardless of location. In the late 1960s, America was becoming more environmentally and health conscious. There was a shift in recreational pursuits with more emphasis on primitive camping and backpacking. The sporting goods manufacturers responded with new lightweight and technical equipment that allowed deeper penetration into backcountry areas. In many cases, there emerged a new type of wilderness traveler with limited experience and a narrow viewpoint of wilderness values. Many visitors at that time, especially horsemen, were not using methods that we would view as acceptable today or easy on the land. The situation was on a collision course, and the horsemen didn't have the numbers to compete politically with the growing number of new users. The same circumstances that had caused an increase in backpackers had generated new horse users who were also inexperienced. Another problem was the attitude of the old-time horse users. They'd been using the same areas and methods for years and thought they had propriety right. Roland Cheek, Dennis Swift, and I hunted together in almost the exact center of the Bob Marshall Wilderness. We could easily see that if the situation didn't improve, our children would probably never again see the Bob from the back of a horse. Nights are long in the Bob in the latter part of September, and our evenings weren't filled with the usual hunting camp lies, but in trying to find a solution to the horse user's problem. The situation was talked about in the fall of 1971, but it was 1972 before we finally decided that our only hope was to form an organization. Cheek was the safety director for Plum Creek Lumber, Swift, a forester and planer mill foreman for Stoltz Land and Lumber, and I worked for the federal government and traveled considerably. We needed someone who was available during the day, so we twisted the arm of Dulane Fulton, a fellow horseman who had recently retired. Many evenings were spent building the framework for an organization that would be both supportive and critical of Forest Service land management proposals by its very nature. In October of 1972, we arranged a meeting in the supervisor's office of the Flathead National Forest with the district rangers of all 4 ranger districts, Glacier National Park personnel, and people from the Forest Service staff. We explained our concept of the organization: education before regulation, review and comment on management plans and regulations, providing a sounding board for necessary regulation and help for low-funded projects. We also volunteered to help reach other horsemen with easier-on-the-land horse handling methods. No punches were pulled. The managing agencies were advised that we were critical of many of their regulations and alarmed at the very pure direction that seemed to be developing for wilderness management. To the agency's credit, they endorsed our concept and encouraged us. I'm sure that many of them had the same feelings for the back of a horse that we did. The 4 of us now had to deal with the problem of forming the new organization. Over the next 2 months, we arranged to speak to every club in the area where we thought there might be potential membership, always explaining that our group would not be in competition with them. Our scope would be narrow, the use of horses in backcountry. Little did we realize that this narrow field of endeavor would be such a large activity. In almost all of these meetings, the same situation developed. Someone responded with a story about how their horse or string had been spooked by a hiker or motorcycle rider. Some were militant, and most had the impression that if you were for something, you were automatically against the other forms of recreational use. Some of these people joined, but few remained long unless they changed their former attitude. What we considered a well-thought-out, responsible approach seemed too slow for them. By early January 1973, we had invited all of our potential support, developed our concept and an interim constitution, and secured all of the local publicity we could for our new organization. On January 17, 1973, we rented a room in a local school and announced an organizational meeting. The meeting was well attended, and all four of us spoke on our concept of the club. The interim constitution was adopted, and Roland Cheek was elected the first president of BCH, with Dulane Fulton as vice president. BCH was born. The mechanics of forming a completely new organization can be staggering. Ours was almost overwhelming. There were no organizations like ours in existence. We had no guidelines, no one to ask for advice, and no one to ask for help but our charter members. We were fortunate that this was a talented group, and the development and adaptation of the basic structure moved swiftly. By summer, we had a work project committee headed by Dennis Swift, and I headed an information and education committee. We had written and printed 5,000 copies of the original BackCountry Horseman's Guidebook, which was mailed free of charge, and we published a newsletter several times a year. We began to focus our attention on the Bob Marshall Wilderness Plan. The draft had been released in 1971, and the response had been almost 90% negative to the Forest Service proposal. Horse users were especially critical because they felt that much of the proposal was biased against horse use in the wilderness that had become almost synonymous with horse use. Despite heavy criticism by the public, the final plan was almost verbatim to the draft. The more traditional conservation groups of our area were strangely silent. Apparently, they were too busy promoting new wilderness candidate study areas to concern themselves with the management of those already existing. Horse users were faced with restrictions that would make their activities almost unfeasible. Some of the most important were: number 1, elimination of hitch rails necessary to help mitigate horse impact is not compatible with wilderness. 2, elimination of sanitation facilities in concentrated use areas as not compatible with wilderness. 3, a deteriorating trail system. 4, the elimination of bridges as not compatible with wilderness. 5, a permit system for horse users only. 6, the elimination of Forest Service cabins as not compatible with wilderness. 7, the rigid interpretation of the ratio of horses per people, regardless of trip duration or supplemental feed requirements of the area. 8, the elimination of trail signs as not compatible with wilderness. They also had large administration sites that are no longer needed and in competition with opportunities for public recreational use. We built arguments countering these regulations that were all defensible from a resource protection standpoint, except for the one that discriminated against one type of user by requiring a permit. After a long battle, all 9 of the objections were decided in BCH's favor, and our growing reputation as a responsible users was strengthened. Kalispell's Daily Interlake of December 13, 1973 read, quote, "The members of the BackCountry Horsemen's Association have put a living meaning into the Forest Service concept of multiple use. The recently formed group has been in existence only a few months. They organized because of a concern, and they drew comments from those individuals opposed to seeing too many horses in the backcountry. They've proved they were needed. They put their muscles and skills to work, completing projects for which the Forest Service did not have the funds or personnel to carry out this year. The backcountry is the better for these individuals. We wish them continued success, intent to complete those tasks which they assign themselves in the time to follow their favorite trails through their favorite terrain." End quote. The Daily Interlake, Progress Edition of 1975 editorialized, quote, "A service organization, second to none, is the BackCountry Horsemen. A dedicated group of persons of all ages, BackCountry Horsemen has time and again demonstrated its responsibility to work for quality wilderness management." End quote. While we're on the subject, let's jump ahead to the November 1982 issue of the Western Horseman, where we also had some credits. Quote, "In Montana, there's a dedicated group called the BackCountry Horsemen, and as their name implies, they like to ride the backcountry. Currently, there are 9 clubs with names like Mission, Missoula, Flathead, Cabinet, Swan Valley, East Slope, Last Chance, Bitterroot, and Salmon. They all nestle in fairly close to the Bob Marshall Wilderness area, and saving the Bob is one of their big projects. They work with local rangers in individual districts within the Forest Service, and each club takes on projects that help make the backcountry a great place to ride. They work on trails, construct road end facilities, clean up campgrounds, build bridges, roll up old wire, build hitch racks, put up trail markers and signs, lay in corduroy, and just about anything else that needs to be done. This is all volunteer work, and work that could not be done with the limited personnel of the Forest Service." End quote. But let's head back to 1974, when differences began to focus on a Forest Service decision to remove a bridge spanning a dangerous creek crossing deep within the Bob Marshall. Horsemen pointed to the agency's listed rationalization that bridges were not appropriate in designated wilderness as justification for the removal. Other groups and individuals joined the charge led by BackCountry Horsemen, and after a tough battle, the agency reversed its decision. Immediately, the Horsemen offered their help in rebuilding the deteriorated structure. All told, the group packed over 13,000 pounds of cement and bridge planking nearly 20 miles into the Bob Marshall. Other members helped disassemble the rotten portions of the bridge and cut and peeled on-site material for the bridge's reconstruction. The Flathead BCH contributed a total of over 1,300 man-hours and 1,800 horse-hours in the Salmon Fork Bridge's reconstruction. It would be easy to rationalize that our early success in the Backcountry Horsemen had a lot to do with luck. I offer 2 articles from old issues of Flathead's newsletter to disprove that. One article states that philosophy, and the other details how the philosophy was developed. To those of you with a high tolerance for pain, I have also included a picture of the 4 founders that was taken at our 10th anniversary celebration in 1983. Bear in mind, the winter of 1982 to 1983 was rough. From the November 1973 issue of Flathead's newsletter, under the editor's opinion, I wrote, "Until the Wilderness Act of 1964, our primitive areas owed their existence largely to remoteness, lack of economic opportunity, and in some cases, the hostility of the land itself. Modern transportation and an increased population have altered these conditions. Areas that many modern-day Americans view almost with reverence were once regarded with apprehension. The fortunes of the nomadic tribes, mountain men, and cattlemen of the open range were directly subject to the whims of nature. Their life was free and unfettered, but their impact on the land was lessened more through a lack of technical advances than it was from environmental concern. In the broad sense, these environmental concerns are a fairly recent development. In past years, when the buffalo or beaver were depleted, the land desecrated by poor mining practices, or the grass became scarce, people moved on to another area. We no longer have the luxury of this abundance of land, and must use the knowledge and experience of the years to protect what remains." Contrary to many of our modern-day teachings, I believe the first true conservationists were the men with deeded land. Their land use practices were the barometer of their economic stability and well-being. With the responsibility of ownership came the realization that they could only reap what they sowed and save only what they rotated. People from other areas and many of our transplanted residents tend to regard our wild lands with a more mystique than most Montanans do. Although Montanans have an equal or even greater love for these areas, their regard for the land is either hereditary or acquired through years of experience with people having first-hand knowledge. They view these areas with a more realistic attitude than some of our well-meaning but starry-eyed friends, much of whose knowledge has been gained by reading Aldo Leopold, Henry Thoreau, or Bob Marshall. These men were far-seeing and eminent in their fields. They should certainly be respected, but not revered. Their writings express their personal philosophies, but a person's wilderness ethic is a matter of his own personal convictions. A portion of this knowledge required for the formation of his beliefs can be gained through books. They are certainly one of our best teachers. In the field of the sciences, they state hard, cold facts, which are used worldwide in different and often opposing philosophies. Philosophy is largely a matter of judgment rather than fact, and a person's knowledge, experience, environment, and mental attitude are all prime factors in shaping his reasoning power and judgment. In the cold, gray light of the dawn of the application of the Wilderness Act, all the hard, cold facts relative to its management should be used in determining that management. Science and logic are as viable a determining factor, or perhaps even more so, than its philosophy. I have sat in discussion groups and have also talked with many knowledgeable individuals about the different aspects of wilderness, many of who were members of other conservation groups. Very often their chief concern has been the approval of other wilderness candidate study areas. I've always been of the opinion that the American people needed these last remaining areas to remain primitive, but in my mind, the management of designated wilderness is paramount in my assessment of the value of more wilderness. It is almost like signing a contract without reading the fine print, only in this case, we are the lending agency and the consequences of a bad decision are irrevocable. We have no collateral once designation is made unless public input is given proper consideration in the formation of the plan under which the area is to be managed. If cooperation is to be achieved, the views of local people and prior use must be integral parts of the management's decision. The views of these people helped protect the wilderness in the past. Local opinion blocked the construction of dams that would have backed water into the wilderness and cloud seeding to alter weather patterns within the wilderness. Shouldn't these people have a voice in the management plan for an area that they both know and love? End quote. Quote, from the outset, the most important and recognized force bringing together our club's variety of people from Whitefish, Kalispell, Columbia Falls, and points between and beyond, into a cohesive, active, dedicated group was the real fear for the future of continued horse in our national parks, wilderness areas, etc. The fear that brought us together should still be present in each of us, since little has changed to allay those suspicions. And yet, we want to be responsible in our approach to the problem, even if we suspect that others are not. We don't want to rush out and tilt with windmills, and yet we would like to know that our people's needs, desires, and ideas are considered before the fact rather than after, as happens so many times. It was in the hope that our club could arrive at an educated, responsible policy toward agency management of backcountry lands and public use of those lands